It was an early evening, the kind that made you feel like summer was lingering just a bit longer than expected. The streets were relatively quiet, with only the occasional sound of a car engine echoing down the long, empty road. Bill Thompson, a veteran cop with over 20 years of experience, sat behind the wheel of his squad car, his eyes scanning the lanes like a hawk. He had a routine patrol route in this neighborhood, one he knew like the back of his hand. He had earned a reputation on the force, one that was admired by some and questioned by others. Thompson had a history of being tough on crime, and while many appreciated his hard-nosed approach, there was an unspoken understanding about who usually bore the brunt of his toughness. Tonight he wasn't expecting much. Maybe a few routine stops, a citation or two. Nothing out of the ordinary. But when a sleek black sedan sped past him, his senses kicked into high gear. The car stood out, not just because of its speed, but because of the way it glided down the road, almost too smoothly for this part of town. His instincts flared. He didn't need to see the driver to know this was the type of car that didn't belong here, at least not in his eyes. Thompson clicked on his lights and siren, the flashing red and blue cutting through the evening air like a blade. The sedan began to slow, pulling over to the side of the road under the dim light of a street lamp. As Thompson approached the vehicle, his hand rested naturally on his holster, a habit he had developed over the years. His eyes scanned the back of the car, checking for anything suspicious, his heart beating slightly faster than usual. He didn't know why, but something about this stop made him more alert. Maybe it was the car, maybe it was the part of town, or maybe it was just his own biases simmering beneath the surface. When he reached the driver's side window, the dark tint rolled down slowly. His eyes immediately fell on the driver, a young black man, probably in his early 20s, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans. Thompson's first instinct wasn't to see the calmness in the man's face or the relaxed way he held the steering wheel. His mind raced through assumptions instead, filing this young man under the categories of trouble, danger, and potential threat. It was how he had been conditioned over the years. His experiences on the job, coupled with the media narratives he consumed, had created a lens through which he viewed young black men, fast cars, potential criminals, and disrespect for the law. "License and registration," Thompson barked, his tone sharper than necessary. He didn't even introduce himself, skipping the formalities that usually accompanied a traffic stop. His hand lingered by his holster, not because of any immediate threat, but because of the perceived one he had conjured in his mind the moment he laid eyes on the driver. The young man didn't flinch. He moved slowly, carefully, as though he had rehearsed this moment many times in his head. In reality, he had. Marcus Johnson had been taught from a young age how to behave during a traffic stop. A lesson passed down from his father and his father before him. His movements were deliberate, calm, and without aggression as he reached for his wallet and pulled out his license. His fingers moved to the glove compartment next, where he retrieved his registration. He handed the documents over without a word, his eyes briefly meeting the officers, not with defiance, but with a quiet resolve that said, "I know exactly what's happening here." Thompson took the documents, not bothering to say thank you. His eyes scanned them quickly, looking for any discrepancies, something, anything, that would validate his assumptions. But the paperwork was clean. Marcus Johnson, age 22, address in a well-to-do neighborhood, no criminal record, no reason to suspect anything more than a speeding violation. But Thompson wasn't ready to let it go that easily. "What are you doing out here, Uwam?" he asked, his voice dripping with an accusatory tone. To Thompson, the question was innocent enough. He was convinced he had the right to know why this young man was driving in this area, at this time, in that kind of car. It wasn't about the speeding anymore. It was about control, about making sure Marcus knew who held the power in this situation. Marcus knew better than to react to the question in any way that could escalate the situation. He had been in similar situations before, and he had seen how quickly things could spiral out of control. He kept his voice even, respectful. "Just heading home after studying at the library," he replied, his tone calm and composed. Thompson wasn't satisfied. He peered into the car, scanning for anything out of place, anything that could be used as a justification for what was becoming a full-blown interrogation. His eyes darted to the passenger seat, then to the back. looking for contraband or something illegal, but the car was spotless. Not even a stray wrapper on the floor. It was immaculate, much to Thompson's frustration. "What library?" Thompson asked, narrowing his eyes as though catching Marcus in some kind of lie. "Uptown Public," Marcus replied without missing a beat. "They stay open late during exam season." Thompson grunted in response, his frustration mounting. He didn't expect such a straightforward answer, and it annoyed him. Marcus wasn't playing into the narrative Thompson had crafted. Instead, he remained cool, collected, and utterly unshaken. And that made Thompson uncomfortable. He wanted control, and right now he didn't feel like he had it. "Mind if I search your vehicle?" Thompson asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. His tone implied that refusing wasn't really an option. Marcus's heart rate quickened, though his exterior remained calm. He knew his rights. He had spent countless hours reading and studying the law, not just because of his ambitions to become a lawyer, but because he knew that knowledge was his greatest weapon in situations like this. He met the officer's gaze unblinking. "Am I being detained, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. "If not, I'd prefer to go on my way." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thompson's face darkened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who he had already decided was beneath him. To Thompson, this wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It was a power struggle. This young man wasn't falling in line the way Thompson expected him to, the way so many others had in the past. The silence between them thickened, the tension palpable. Marcus remained firm in his seat, refusing to waver or let fear dictate his actions. He had done nothing wrong, and he wasn't about to let Thompson bully him into thinking otherwise. The tension between them only seemed to grow heavier, like the humid air right before a thunderstorm. Officer Thompson stood there, still holding Marcus's license and registration, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. He wasn't used to this kind of pushback, especially not from someone like Marcus. It gnawed at him, this feeling that he wasn't in control of the situation. He had expected Marcus to be nervous, to comply without question, and yet here was this young man, completely composed, asking if he was being detained as though he knew every line of the law better than the officer himself. For Thompson, this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It had become something more personal. Years of working the streets, of dealing with difficult situations, had hardened him. He had built walls around himself, emotional fortifications that blocked out any vulnerability or second-guessing. But in this moment, Marcus's calm, respectful demeanor was tearing down those walls, brick by brick, in a way Thompson didn't fully understand. "Stay in the car," Thompson muttered before turning on his heel and walking back toward his squad car. He needed to regroup, needed a moment to think. As he sat in his car, flipping through Marcus's documents again, he felt the simmering frustration inside him begin to bubble to the surface. Why was this kid getting under his skin so much? Thompson knew the law. He had been enforcing it for decades. But in his gut, he also knew that this stop wasn't really about the law anymore. It had morphed into something uglier, something that made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Thompson grabbed his radio, his thumb hesitating for a moment before pressing the button. "Officer Thompson requesting backup at 5th and Elm," he said, his voice crackling through the airwaves. He didn't need backup, not really, but calling for additional officers would send a message, not only to Marcus but to himself, that he was still in control, that he still held the power in this encounter. He knew deep down that there was nothing suspicious about Marcus. The car was clean, the papers were in order, and the young man had done nothing but follow every instruction to the letter. But that didn't matter. Not in the heat of this moment. Thompson's pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to let it go so easily. As he waited for backup, Thompson glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Marcus still sitting in the car, perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Marcus wasn't checking his phone, wasn't fidgeting, wasn't doing anything that could be construed as aggressive or evasive. He was just waiting for what came next. The minutes stretched on, each one longer than the last, until finally the distant wail of sirens filled the air. 2 more patrol cars arrived, pulling up behind Thompson's squad car with their lights flashing. The officers who stepped out were younger, newer to the force, and they quickly approached Thompson with questions in their eyes. They didn't know the details, only that Thompson had called for backup, which usually meant there was something serious happening. They were ready, prepared for anything. Thompson straightened his posture, slipping into his role as the senior officer, the one in charge. He gestured toward Marcus's car without much explanation. "Speeding violation," he said, his voice steady, but still simmering with irritation. "But something doesn't feel right about this. I want to take a closer look." The other officers exchanged glances, a bit confused by the vagueness of his explanation, but not questioning him directly. After all, Thompson had been on the force longer than they had even dreamed of. His instincts were trusted, his judgment rarely questioned. If he felt there was more to this stop, they weren't about to argue. Thompson walked back toward Marcus's car, the younger officers following a few steps behind. The additional police presence didn't go unnoticed by Marcus. He could see them in his rearview mirror. Two more white officers standing behind Thompson, their expressions unreadable, their stances tense. Marcus took a deep breath. He knew what this looked like. He had seen it before, heard the stories, watched the videos that had gone viral on social media. His pulse quickened slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm. There was no reason to panic, not yet. He had done everything right. He was in the clear. Thompson leaned down again to speak through the open window, but his tone had shifted ever so slightly, adopting a more aggressive edge now that his colleagues were watching. "You mind stepping out of the car for me?" he asked, though it was clear from his tone that it wasn't really a request. Marcus turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting Thompson's. He had a choice to make, and he knew that this moment could be the turning point. He could comply and hope for the best, or he could stand his ground and remind the officer, once again, that he hadn't been given a lawful reason for being detained. The weight of the situation pressed on his chest, but his mind was clear. He had learned enough about the law to know that stepping out of the car could escalate things in ways he couldn't predict. "Officer, with all due respect," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to know if I'm being detained. If not, I'd prefer to stay in the vehicle." Thompson's eyes narrowed, the barely concealed frustration bubbling up again. He could feel the younger officers watching him closely, waiting to see how he would handle this. Marcus's refusal to step out of the car wasn't aggressive. It was measured, controlled, but it still felt like a challenge, one that Thompson wasn't willing to back down from. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. The other officers shifted their weight, glancing at each other, unsure of what to do next. They had expected Thompson to take control of the situation, to assert his authority in a way that would leave no room for debate. But now they were beginning to see that this wasn't going to be a simple traffic stop. Thompson leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though the sharpness in his tone cut through the air. "You think you're smarter than me?" he asked, his words dripping with condescension. "You think because you know a few legal terms, you're going to tell me how to do my job?" Marcus didn't flinch. He held Thompson's gaze unblinking. He could feel the tension rising, but he refused to let it rattle him. He had studied the law for this exact reason, so that he could protect himself in moments like this. He wasn't trying to outsmart the officer. He was just trying to make sure his rights were respected. "I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, officer," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm just asking if there's a legal reason for you to detain me. If not, I'd like to be on my way." Thompson's grip on his holster tightened, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the other officer's eyes on him, waiting for him to make a move. This wasn't going the way he had planned. He had expected Marcus to fold, to get nervous, to comply without question. But instead, Marcus was standing his ground, refusing to be intimidated. And that made Thompson feel something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. It was a small flicker, deep inside, but it was there. For the first time, he questioned whether he was in the right. But he quickly shoved that thought aside, refusing to let it take hold. He had been on the force too long to let a kid like Marcus make him second-guess himself. He had seen enough, dealt with enough, to know that he was the one with the authority here. But that doubt, as small as it was, lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing at him as the seconds ticked by. The two additional patrol cars had pulled up behind Officer Thompson's vehicle, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows that danced along the sides of the road. The street, which had been so quiet just moments ago, now felt like the center of attention, even though there were no bystanders in sight. It was as though the air itself had grown heavier with the arrival of backup. The younger officers, fresh-faced and eager to prove themselves, exited their vehicles with a sense of anticipation. For them, being called to a scene by a senior officer like Thompson meant there was something serious happening, something they needed to be ready for. They hadn't asked many questions over the radio. There was an unspoken understanding that when a senior officer called for help, you responded first and asked questions later. Thompson barely acknowledged their arrival. His mind was swirling with a mix of emotions, none of which he was willing to confront just yet. His pride, his years of experience, and the deep-seated biases he carried all battled for dominance in his mind. He knew these younger officers were watching him, waiting to see how he handled the situation. That only added to the pressure, feeding his need to maintain control at all costs. He couldn't let this young man, this Marcus Johnson, show him up in front of his colleagues. Not now, not ever. Marcus could see them all clearly in his rearview mirror, the two new officers standing a few paces behind Thompson, their expressions unreadable, but their postures tense. He knew what their presence signaled. In his experience, when more officers showed up, things could go one of two ways. Either they would diffuse the situation, bringing cooler heads to the table, or they would escalate it, their sheer numbers serving to intimidate and overpower. Marcus wasn't sure which way this was headed, but he knew he had to stay calm. His heart was beating faster now, the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins, but he kept his breathing steady. His thoughts remained clear. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was about power and control, and now with more officers on the scene, the stakes had risen even higher. The young officers exchanged a glance, then looked toward Thompson for direction. One of them, Officer Riley, took a step forward, his hand resting casually near his own holster, though not as overtly as Thompson's. His voice was level, polite even. "What's the situation here, sir?" he asked, careful not to overstep. Riley had only been on the force for a few years, and though he respected Thompson's experience, he could sense that something was off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the tension in the air didn't feel justified. A routine traffic stop, even one that required backup, usually didn't carry this much unease. Thompson turned slightly, not fully looking at Riley, his jaw tight. "Speeding violation," he said through gritted teeth, as if the explanation alone wasn't enough to communicate the underlying frustration he felt. "But I've got a feeling there's more going on here." Officer Riley glanced toward Marcus's car, still confused. A simple speeding ticket shouldn't require this level of backup, and certainly not this level of tension. But Riley had learned early on not to question his superiors, especially not in front of the suspect. So, he nodded, stepping back in line with the other officer, who had remained silent up to this point. They would follow Thompson's lead for now. Meanwhile, inside the car, Marcus was considering his next move. He could feel the tension thickening outside, the officers gathering, their body language stiff and guarded. It reminded him of every other story he had ever heard, every incident he had ever read about. The simple traffic stops that ended in tragedy, where minor infractions led to major consequences simply because of the color of someone's skin. He had prepared for this moment his whole life, it seemed, but that didn't make it any less nerve-wracking. The words of his father echoed in his mind, lessons passed down from one generation to the next. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly. Stay calm, no matter what. They're going to look for a reason to escalate things, but don't give them one. Marcus had always known these lessons weren't just words of wisdom. They were a matter of survival. And now, sitting in his car, with 3 officers outside, he felt the weight of those lessons more than ever. Thompson, still holding Marcus's license and registration, glanced back at the 2 younger officers, feeling their eyes on him. His frustration was mounting, but he also felt something else creeping in, uncertainty. It gnawed at him, but he pushed it down, unwilling to let it surface. His instincts had always served him well, hadn't they? 20 years on the job had taught him to trust his gut, and right now his gut was telling him there was more to Marcus than met the eye. But the deeper question the one he refused to face, was why his gut told him that. Was it really Marcus's behavior that set him off, or was it something else? Something he didn't want to admit? Thompson cleared his throat, addressing Marcus through the open window once again. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice firm, though there was a slight tremor in it now, barely perceptible but there. Marcus's eyes flicked to Thompson, and for a moment their gazes locked. The young man had remained remarkably calm throughout the entire interaction, but now he could sense that the situation was teetering on the edge of something much more dangerous. He had been respectful, compliant, and had done nothing to warrant being asked to step out of the car. He knew his rights, and he knew that unless Thompson had probable cause, he wasn't legally required to get out. But the reality of the situation wasn't lost on him. He could refuse, stand his ground as he had every right to do. But what would that achieve? With 3 officers on the scene, all of them white, and with tension as high as it was, a refusal could lead to an escalation that Marcus wasn't sure would end in his favor. The choice weighed heavily on him, but before he could respond, something caught Thompson's eye, something small but undeniable. There on the back window of Marcus's car was a sticker. Not just any sticker, but one from a prestigious law firm in the city, one that Thompson recognized instantly. It was a firm known for taking on high-profile civil rights cases, and seeing that sticker sent a jolt through Thompson's system. He blinked, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer, scrutinizing the sticker as if trying to make sure he was seeing it correctly. Marcus followed his gaze and knew immediately what had caught the officer's attention. That sticker was from the law firm where Marcus had recently started interning, a position he had worked incredibly hard to earn. It was more than just a symbol of his job. It was a symbol of his future, of the life he was building for himself, despite all the obstacles placed in his way. Thompson straightened up, his face betraying a momentary flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected that. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the young man in front of him with the prestigious law firm sticker on the back of his car. For a split second, the narrative that Thompson had built in his head began to crumble. He had come into this stop with assumptions about who Marcus was, about what kind of person drove a car like this in a neighborhood like this at this time of night. But that sticker, that small detail, was unraveling all of those assumptions in real time. "What's that?" Thompson asked, his voice sounding less sure than before. He pointed to the sticker, though he already knew what it was. Marcus met his gaze evenly, sensing the shift in the air. "I'm interning there," he said calmly, though the gravity of the moment wasn't lost on him. "It's part of my scholarship program. I'm studying to be a lawyer." The silence that followed was deafening. The 2 younger officers exchanged glances, their confusion growing. They hadn't expected this turn of events. Thompson, for his part, seemed frozen in place, his hand still gripping Marcus's documents, though he had stopped looking at them. The words hung in the air. "I'm studying to be a lawyer." For Thompson, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. He had built his career on gut instincts, on following his experience and his hunches. But now, faced with this young man, who was clearly intelligent, driven, and connected to a powerful law firm, Thompson's instincts were betraying him. All of his assumptions about Marcus, all the narratives he had spun in his head, were crashing down around him, and he didn't know what to do about it. Thompson swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He tried to regain his composure, to remind himself that he was still in control of the situation. But the truth was, he wasn't sure he was anymore. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as Officer Thompson stood by Marcus's car, processing the young man's words. The phrase, "I'm studying to be a lawyer," echoed in his mind, hitting him harder than he expected. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed down, like the street around them had fallen away, and all that was left was the weight of Thompson's own thoughts. It wasn't just the law firm sticker that had thrown him off balance. It was everything that sticker represented. It was Marcus's poise, his calmness under pressure, and now the knowledge that this young man wasn't just anyone. He wasn't the stereotype Thompson had unconsciously, or maybe consciously, built in his mind when he first pulled him over. He was someone with a future, someone who understood the law well enough to stand his ground, and that changed everything. Thompson blinked, breaking the stillness as his mind raced to reconcile the image of Marcus with the version of him he had so quickly judged. This was not how things were supposed to go. A part of him wanted to double down, to find something, anything that could justify the way he had escalated the situation. But that justification wasn't coming. The more he looked at Marcus, the more he saw the calm determination in the young man's eyes. The more the officer felt his own confidence slipping away. Behind him, the two younger officers shifted uncomfortably, still unsure of what exactly they were dealing with. They had responded to Thompson's call, ready for action, prepared for a situation that might have required force or at least a firm hand. But this wasn't it. They could sense it now, the unease in the air, the way Thompson was hesitating, as if he himself was no longer sure of the justification for this stop. And in that hesitation, there was a crack, a small one, but noticeable enough for them to realize that maybe this wasn't the serious situation they had expected. Marcus watched it all unfold from inside his car, his heart still beating fast, but his exterior as calm as ever. He knew that this was a pivotal moment, one that could go in several different directions, depending on how Thompson reacted next. He had already seen the flash of doubt cross the officer's face when he mentioned his internship. It was a small victory, but Marcus wasn't naive enough to think it meant he was in the clear. He knew the intricacies of these encounters, how quickly things could turn, even when logic and law were on your side. Still, he felt that flicker of hope, that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Thompson cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation, though it felt like control was slipping through his fingers. He glanced back at the younger officers, their expectant faces now tinged with confusion. He needed to say something, needed to do something that would reassert his authority without admitting outright that he had misjudged the situation. He opened his mouth, but no words came out for a second. His mind was a jumble of conflicting emotions: pride, anger, embarrassment, and, beneath it all, something even more uncomfortable: guilt. "Law school, huh?" Thompson finally said, his voice sounding more uncertain than he intended. He glanced at the law firm sticker again, as though verifying that it hadn't magically disappeared. "Well, you should still be more careful driving around here. Speed limits are for everyone." It was a weak attempt to justify his earlier aggression, and even as the words left his mouth, Thompson knew they sounded hollow. He wasn't really addressing the issue at hand anymore. He was trying to salvage what was left of his pride. In his mind, he couldn't admit to the full extent of his error, not in front of the other officers, and certainly not in front of Marcus. To do so would be to admit that he had let his biases cloud his judgment, that he had escalated a simple traffic stop because of assumptions he hadn't even bothered to question. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but inside he felt a mix of relief and frustration. He could tell that Thompson was backing down, but the officer still wasn't acknowledging the real reason this encounter had spiraled in the first place. It wasn't about speeding. It never had been. It was about the fact that, from the moment Thompson had seen him, he had been judged, not as a student, not as a young man on his way home, but as a potential threat. And now, even as Thompson fumbled through a half-hearted warning, Marcus knew that the officer still hadn't fully reckoned with that truth. "Of course, officer," Marcus replied, his tone respectful but with an undertone that suggested he wasn't fooled by Thompson's weak attempt at justification. "I always try to follow the law." There was a subtle tension in his words, a quiet challenge that didn't go unnoticed by Thompson. Marcus wasn't going to push it, wasn't going to argue, but there was an implicit reminder there. Marcus knew the law, and he knew how close Thompson had come to crossing it. Thompson, for his part, bristled slightly at Marcus's response, hearing the unspoken message. But what could he say? He couldn't push back without looking even more foolish, so he nodded stiffly, as though the matter were settled. The two younger officers watched the exchange in silence, still unsure of what had really happened here. From their perspective, Thompson had handled the situation, albeit awkwardly, but they didn't understand the layers beneath the surface. The biases that had driven Thompson to call for backup in the first place, the assumptions that had nearly escalated an unnecessary situation. They only saw the outcome: a young black man in a nice car, talking about law school and internships, and an older officer trying to save face after a drawn-out traffic stop that had turned into something it shouldn't have. Thompson handed Marcus back his license and registration, his movements jerky and uncharacteristically hesitant. He opened his mouth again, as if to offer another parting warning or instruction, but then he stopped himself. What more could he say? Any further words would only dig the hole deeper, make the entire situation even more awkward. So instead, he stepped back, giving a sharp nod. "You're free to go," he said finally, the words almost begrudging. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment as he reached for his documents and tucked them back into his glove compartment. For a second, he considered saying something more, considered making one final point about how this entire situation had played out. But he knew better. The moment had passed. Anything he said now would only risk reigniting a confrontation that was already on the brink of being diffused. Instead, he nodded politely, his face giving nothing away. "Thank you, officer," Marcus said quietly, though the words didn't carry much gratitude. It was more a formality, a way to end the interaction cleanly. Thompson turned away quickly, heading back toward his patrol car without another word. The two younger officers followed suit, though their expressions were still uncertain, as though they hadn't fully processed what had just transpired. As they walked back to their vehicles, Thompson's mind raced. He was angry, but not at Marcus. He was angry at himself, though he wouldn't admit it outright. Angry that he had let the situation get so out of hand, that he had allowed his own biases to dictate his actions, and that, in the end, it had all unraveled because of a law firm sticker and a few calm words from a young man who had refused to play the part Thompson had assigned to him. Marcus started his car, the engine humming softly as he pulled back onto the road. The flashing lights from the patrol cars faded into the background, but the encounter still hung heavy in the air. As he drove away, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a deep-seated frustration. He had avoided what could have been a far worse outcome, but the fact that he had even been put in that position gnawed at him. He had done everything right, and yet, from the moment the officer had seen him, none of that had mattered. The road stretched ahead of him, the city lights flickering in the distance as he navigated through the streets. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he would face a situation like this. It was part of the reality of being a young black man in America, even one studying to be a lawyer, even one with a bright future ahead of him. The rules were different for him, and no amount of education or success would change that. But still, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. He had stood his ground, remained calm, and in the end, he had forced Thompson to confront something, whether the officer realized it or not. Thompson, sitting in his squad car as Marcus drove away, stared at the dashboard, lost in thought. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, not even himself, but that brief encounter had shaken something loose inside him. It wasn't a dramatic shift, not yet, but it was enough to leave him sitting there, staring at the empty street, questioning, if only for a moment, whether he had been wrong. And that doubt, that small crack in the wall of certainty that Thompson had built over years on the job, would stay with him, long after Marcus had driven out of sight. As Marcus's car disappeared into the distance, the tension in the air still lingered, hanging thick between Officer Thompson and the younger officers who stood by their patrol cars. It wasn't just the aftermath of a routine traffic stop. It was something far more complex, and everyone present could feel it. Thompson remained by his squad car, his back turned to the younger officers, as if trying to shield himself from the scrutiny that now seemed inevitable. His mind was churning, the storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions crashing together inside him. He wanted to believe that he had handled things appropriately, that his instincts had been correct. But the doubt was there, gnawing away at his sense of control. The younger officers, Reilly and Martinez, watched him, exchanging uncertain glances. They had been ready for a more aggressive situation, something dangerous, but instead, they had found themselves caught in a tense interaction that didn't quite make sense to them. It was obvious that Thompson had called them in anticipation of something more. But what exactly? They hadn't been told the full story, and now, watching Thompson wrestle with whatever had just happened, they were left to wonder what had really driven the call for backup. Officer Riley hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice quiet but respectful. "Is everything okay, sir?" he asked, careful not to sound like he was questioning Thompson's judgment directly. He knew Thompson was a veteran on the force, a man with years of experience who commanded respect. But even Riley couldn't help but feel that something about the whole situation had been off. He had expected to find a dangerous suspect, someone who posed a real threat. But what he had found was a young man sitting in a nice car, calm and composed, who had seemed more in control of the law than any of them. Thompson's back stiffened at the question, his pride flaring for a moment. His first instinct was to snap at Riley, to shut down any inquiry into his actions. But instead, he swallowed the words, recognizing that they would only deepen the growing sense of unease. He turned around, his face carefully composed into a mask of indifference, though the strain behind his eyes was still visible. "Yeah," Thompson muttered, forcing a nod. "Everything's fine. Just a routine stop that got a little more complicated than I expected." Riley nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. "Complicated?" he echoed, trying to understand without overstepping. "The guy seemed pretty straightforward, didn't he?" Thompson shot him a look, his expression hardening. "You didn't see everything," he snapped, more defensive than he intended. He didn't like where this was going, didn't like the idea that his judgment was being questioned, especially by a younger officer. But even as the words left his mouth, Thompson knew he wasn't convincing anyone, least of all himself. The truth was, he had seen everything. He had seen Marcus's calm demeanor, his measured words, the quiet intelligence behind his responses. He had seen the law firm sticker, the quiet confidence with which Marcus had held his ground. And none of it had lined up with the assumptions Thompson had made the moment he had seen Marcus's face, his skin, his car. The realization was uncomfortable, too uncomfortable to fully acknowledge in the moment. Riley held up his hands in a gesture of peace, sensing the tension in Thompson's voice. "Of course, sir. I was just surprised is all. It didn't seem like there was much to justify calling for backup. That's all I meant." His tone was careful, but it was clear that he wasn't the only one who had noticed the disconnect between Thompson's actions and the reality of the situation. Martinez, who had remained quiet until now, cleared his throat. "Looked like the kid knew his stuff," he said, his voice more casual, but with a hint of curiosity. "Law school and all that? Guess that kind of threw us for a loop." Thompson didn't respond right away. His jaw clenched, his mind racing through the series of events that had just unfolded. The doubt that had been creeping in since he saw the law firm sticker now felt like a full-blown internal battle. He knew he had misjudged Marcus. He knew at the moment Marcus had calmly asked if he was being detained. But admitting that out loud, admitting that he had let his own biases shape his actions, that was something Thompson wasn't prepared to do, not in front of the younger officers, and certainly not in front of himself. "People can put up fronts," Thompson muttered, trying to dismiss the subject. "Just because he's got a sticker from some law firm doesn't mean he's clean. You never know with these types." The phrase hung in the air, heavier than he intended, and the weight of it wasn't lost on the younger officers. Martinez raised an eyebrow slightly, his expression turning more thoughtful. "These types," he repeated, though his tone was light. The implication behind the words was clear. He wasn't about to challenge Thompson directly. Martinez wasn't a rookie, but he wasn't seasoned enough to push back too hard either. Still, the question lingered between them, unspoken but present. What had Thompson meant by these types? And how much of what had just happened was driven by the assumptions Thompson had made the moment he saw Marcus behind the wheel? Thompson knew he had misspoken, but rather than correct himself, he doubled down. "You've got to stay alert out here," he said, his tone firm but hollow. "It's not about how they act on the surface. You've got to be ready for anything." Riley and Martinez exchanged another glance, but neither of them pushed further. It wasn't their place to confront Thompson, at least not directly, but the unease was there, settling in between them like a fog. They had seen the same thing Thompson had, the calm, respectful young man who had handled the situation with more composure than most people they encountered. And they couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, Thompson had overreacted. As the younger officers made their way back to their patrol cars, Thompson remained by his vehicle, staring at the empty stretch of road where Marcus's car had once been. His mind was still racing, caught in a loop of frustration and confusion. He wanted to believe that he had been right, that his instincts had been sound, but the truth was gnawing at him. It wasn't Marcus who had been the problem. It was the assumptions Thompson had brought with him to the stop. Thompson leaned against the hood of his squad car, rubbing a hand across his face. He felt exhausted, more mentally than physically. For years, he had prided himself on being able to read people, to sense when something was off. It was what had kept him safe, what had allowed him to navigate the tough neighborhoods and the difficult situations. But this time, his instincts had failed him. Or maybe more accurately, they hadn't failed him. He had failed to see beyond them. He had let his prejudices, the ones he refused to fully acknowledge, shape his actions in ways that even he couldn't justify. He glanced back toward the other officers, who were now sitting in their patrol cars, waiting for further instruction. The night was settling back into its routine rhythm, the distant hum of the city beginning to fade into the background. But for Thompson, the routine was broken. He had been shaken, not by Marcus's actions, but by his own. By the realization that he had nearly escalated a situation that should have been nothing more than a routine traffic stop, all because he had looked at Marcus and seen a threat where none existed. The nagging doubt, the one that had first surfaced when Marcus mentioned his internship, was now a full-blown awareness that he had been wrong. And the worst part? He didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to reconcile the man he saw himself as, the tough, no-nonsense officer who kept the streets safe, with the reality of what had just happened. Thompson exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to face the truth that had been creeping up on him since the moment he saw that sticker on Marcus's car. But it was there, undeniable now. He had been wrong. And it wasn't just a mistake in judgment, it was something deeper, something more uncomfortable. As he stood there alone in the dark, Thompson felt a strange sense of isolation, not from the other officers, but from himself. The man he had always believed himself to be, the man who prided himself on fairness and justice, had been confronted with the truth of his own bias. And now there was no turning away from it. The question now was what he would do with that knowledge. Would he bury it, pretend it never happened, and continue on as he always had? Or would he confront it, acknowledge the hard truth that his actions tonight had been shaped by something far more insidious than he had ever allowed himself to believe? For now, Thompson wasn't sure. But as he climbed back into his squad car and turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming to life beneath him, he knew one thing for certain. This night, and the young man who had forced him to face his own prejudices would stay with him for a long time. As Officer Thompson sat behind the wheel of his squad car, he could still feel the tension vibrating through his body. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring blankly at the road ahead. The red and blue lights reflected off the windshield, their flicker creating ghostly shadows that danced around him. But the rhythmic pulse of those lights couldn't drown out the noise in his mind. It was louder now than it had been all night, a constant thrum of questions, doubts, and self-reflections that he had never let surface before. Thompson had always prided himself on his ability to read situations, to sense danger before it unfolded. It was something that had served him well in his 2 decades on the force. He had stopped more than his fair share of criminals, had been in life or death situations where his instincts had saved him and others. But this wasn't that. This time his instincts had betrayed him, or rather, they had exposed something about himself he wasn't ready to confront. The night air seeped into the car through the partially cracked window, cool against his flushed skin. Thompson's heart still beat fast, but not from adrenaline. It was something else, an unease he couldn't shake. He had called for backup, convinced that Marcus Johnson was more than what he appeared. But in truth, Marcus was exactly what he appeared, an intelligent, composed young man who had done nothing wrong. And Thompson, blinded by years of ingrained assumptions, had escalated a situation that never should have gone that far. The 2 younger officers, Riley and Martinez, had already pulled away, leaving Thompson alone on the dimly lit street. He sat there for a long time, the engine idling as he replayed the stop over and over in his mind. His thoughts lingered on the moment Marcus had calmly asked if he was being detained. It was such a simple question, one that Marcus had every right to ask, but the way Thompson had reacted to it revealed everything. He had felt his authority being questioned, not by a criminal, but by a young black man who knew the law better than most. Thompson hated to admit it, but that was the moment his frustration had turned to something darker. It wasn't just about control. It was about the fact that, deep down, he hadn't expected someone like Marcus to know his rights so well. And that realization gnawed at him. Thompson's fingers tapped against the steering wheel as he thought about Marcus's words. The young man had been respectful, polite, and yet firm in his understanding of his rights. He hadn't lashed out, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything to justify the escalation. And yet Thompson had felt threatened, not physically, but in a way that was harder to define. Marcus represented something Thompson had never fully considered before: the possibility that he, Thompson, might be the problem in these situations, that his biases, unconscious or otherwise, were shaping the way he approached his job, his interactions, and the people he encountered. He had always believed himself to be fair, to be just. He wasn't one of those officers who let race cloud his judgment, or so he had thought, but tonight had shown him otherwise. Marcus had exposed something in him, something Thompson didn't want to see. The assumptions he had made the moment he saw Marcus's car, the way he had tensed up when he saw a young black man behind the wheel, it had all been based on a bias Thompson didn't want to admit he had. And now, sitting in his squad car, alone in the dark, he couldn't escape that truth. For years, Thompson had dismissed the idea of systemic bias in law enforcement. He had seen the debates on television, the protests in the streets, but he had always viewed himself as separate from all that. He was just doing his job, enforcing the law as it was written. But now he realized it wasn't that simple. The law wasn't just something written in a book. It was something applied by people. People like him, with their own assumptions, prejudices, and blind spots. And those blind spots, as tonight had shown him, could lead to dangerous situations. Thompson thought back to Marcus's calm demeanor, the quiet way he had asserted his rights without escalating the situation. He had handled himself better than many people Thompson had encountered in far less tense situations. And that bothered him, not because Marcus had been in the right, but because Thompson had been so quick to put him in the wrong. He had been looking for something, anything, that would justify his suspicions, and when he found nothing, it only made him angrier. Not at Marcus, but at himself, because deep down, Thompson knew he had been wrong from the start. He let out a long breath, staring at the street in front of him. What was he supposed to do with this realization? He had built his entire career on being tough, on trusting his instincts. But what if those instincts weren't as reliable as he thought? What if they were tainted by years of conditioning, by the culture of the force, by the media, by society itself? Thompson wasn't sure he was ready to answer those questions, but ignoring them now felt impossible. As the minutes ticked by, Thompson felt the weight of his badge grow heavier. It was more than just a symbol of authority now. It was a reminder of the responsibility that came with it. The responsibility to not only enforce the law, but to do so fairly, without letting personal biases color his actions. He had failed in that tonight, and he knew it. The question was whether he would let that failure define him or whether he would learn from it. For the first time in a long time, Thompson felt vulnerable. Vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger, but everything to do with confronting the kind of man he was. He had always seen himself as a protector, someone who kept the streets safe. But now he realized that keeping the streets safe wasn't just about arresting criminals or writing tickets. It was about treating people fairly, no matter who they were or what they looked like. It was about recognizing when you were in the wrong and having the humility to admit it, even if it meant questioning everything you thought you knew. Thompson didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't keep doing things the way he had always done them. Tonight had changed something in him, cracked open a part of his mind that he hadn't even realized was closed. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew he had to be better. He had to be more aware, more thoughtful, and more willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he was a part of. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was late, and the night felt impossibly long. But as he put the car in drive and pulled away from the scene, Thompson knew that this night would stay with him for a long time, longer than most. It would stay with him because it had forced him to see himself in a way he never had before, and that kind of self-reflection wasn't something you could easily shake. As Marcus drove through the quiet streets, the glow of the city's lights casting long shadows on the pavement, he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief, yes, but also frustration. The encounter had ended without incident, but it had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had done everything right, had been respectful, calm, and collected. But the fact remained that the stop had escalated simply because of who he was, where he was, and how he looked. Marcus replayed the events in his mind, trying to understand how things had gone from a simple traffic stop to a situation that had required backup. He knew the answer, of course. He had known it long before Thompson had called for additional officers. It wasn't about the speed limit. It was about the assumptions that had been made the moment Thompson saw him behind the wheel. Marcus had felt it in the officer's tone, in the way Thompson had approached his car with suspicion already in his eyes. He had known without a doubt that this wasn't just about a traffic violation. But Marcus had been here before. He had grown up learning how to navigate these kinds of encounters, had been taught by his parents the unwritten rules of how to survive interactions with law enforcement. Keep your hands visible, speak clearly, don't argue, don't make sudden movements. Do everything you can to de-escalate, even if you're not the one escalating in the first place. It was a lesson passed down from generation to generation, and Marcus had absorbed it all his life. It was a sad reality, but it was his reality. And yet this time had felt different. This time, Marcus hadn't just been a passive participant in the encounter. He had asserted his rights, had calmly but firmly questioned the officer's actions, and in the end, he had forced Thompson to back down. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. Marcus knew that his knowledge of the law had played a role, that his education had given him the tools to navigate the situation in a way that most people couldn't. But still, the fact that he had to do that at all, that he had to be on guard, ready to defend himself not just from physical danger, but from the assumptions others made about him, was exhausting. As Marcus drove, he thought about his future. He had big plans: law school, a career in civil rights, a desire to change the system from within. But he knew that no matter how far he went, no matter how much he achieved, encounters like this would always be a part of his life. The road ahead was long, and the fight for justice was far from over.